He was cut down on a battlefield, his bones shattered. His body failed. Every system inside him shut down in sequence, the way they always do at the end of a life. And then he got back up, not through a miracle, not through the intervention of something merciful or good, through hatred, through a will so absolute and so total that the dark side of the Force answered it, the only way the dark side knows how to answer anything, completely, and at a price nobody warned him about. That price was this. Every single step he took from that moment forward was agony, not discomfort, not the manageable pain of a soldier who has learned to fight through injury. Pure, unfiltered, continuous agony. His bones never fully healed. His flesh never fully closed. His body was permanently in the process of both dying and being rebuilt, and he felt every single instant of that dual process with a clarity that left nothing out. He chose this. He kept choosing it. Every day, every hour, for decades. That is what makes Darth Sion different from every other dark side figure in the history of the Star Wars galaxy. Not the power, not the violence. The choice, the specific and terrible choice to survive at any cost, made in a single desperate moment, and then sustained past every point at which any other living being would have let go. This is not a story about a monster. It is something far more disturbing than that. Every single step was agony. Every breath dragged through lungs that had been destroyed and rebuilt, and destroyed again so many times that the tissue between them had long since stopped resembling anything truly organic. His skin was a patchwork of wounds in various stages of refusing to heal, split open and gray and pulled tight over bones that had been broken in so many places that the skeleton underneath looked less like a human frame and more like a structure assembled by someone who had only ever heard a skeleton described, to them secondhand, in a language that wasn't quite their own. His eyes were pale, clouded over with something that wasn't quite cataracts and wasn't quite death, but sat somewhere in the long, uncomfortable space between the two, belonging fully to neither. He could see through them anyway. He could see perfectly. The darkness around him felt like something old and familiar, something that had always been waiting, and through it he moved with the slow, deliberate patience of something that had nowhere particular to be, and nothing left to fear, because fear requires the possibility of something worse happening. For Darth Sion, nothing worse was possible. The worst had already happened. He was still here. The horror at the center of this story is not the violence, though there was plenty of that, stretching across decades of galactic conflict. Not the power, though it was immense and in many respects unlike anything else the history of the Sith had produced. The horror is much quieter and much more personal than either of those things. The horror is a man who chose pain over peace and kept choosing it, day after day, for years and then decades, because the alternative was letting go. And letting go was the one thing Darth Sion fundamentally, absolutely, could not do. This is his story. And it is one of the most disturbing things the Star Wars universe has ever produced. To understand what Sion became, you first have to understand what the galaxy was like during the era that made him. This is not the time of Palpatine and the Empire. This is not the age of the Skywalkers and lightsaber duels above exploding battle stations. This is thousands of years before any of that, before those names and those conflicts existed even as seeds in the long soil of galactic history. This is the Old Republic era, a time when the galaxy was larger and stranger, and in many ways more dangerous than most people in the centuries that followed would ever fully know or appreciate. The Republic existed. Yes, the Jedi Order existed. But the scale of what happened during this period dwarfs almost everything that came after it. Wars that lasted decades, conflicts that pulled entire star systems into ruin so complete that some of those systems never fully recovered. Sith empires that genuinely, repeatedly threatened to wipe the Republic from existence, not once, not twice, but in waves. Each one arriving before the wounds from the previous one had entirely closed, each one finding a galaxy still raw and still hurting from what came before. The galaxy during this period was a place that had known far more war than peace, and the people shaped by it bore the marks of that history in ways that went deep. The Mandalorian Wars were one of the defining catastrophes of the era, a conflict that began when the Mandalorian clans, united under the leadership of Mandalore the Ultimate, launched a campaign of conquest across the Outer Rim that the Republic was desperately, embarrassingly slow to respond to. The Jedi Council, cautious and deliberate, as it had always been and arguably always needed to be, debated the wisdom of direct involvement. They sensed something wrong about the war, something they could perceive through the Force, but not quite articulate in words. A manipulation lurking behind the Mandalorian aggression, a hidden hand guiding events toward an outcome that the Council could feel coming without being able to see it clearly enough to act on. This uncertainty made them hesitant to commit the Order's full strength to a conflict whose true nature they did not yet understand. But not every Jedi was willing to wait. Two of the most gifted Force users of their generation, a pair of knights who would eventually be known across the whole sweep of galactic history as Revan and Malak, looked at the carnage spreading through the Outer Rim and decided, with the clarity of people who believed deeply in their own judgment, that waiting was a form of moral failure. They defied the Council. They called for volunteers among the Order and found more than enough. And they led a coalition of Jedi and Republic soldiers into the war that the Council had not yet decided to fight. Thousands followed them. Among those thousands was a warrior whose name, at that time, was not Sion. It was something else. Something that history has not preserved in the records that survived the chaos of the decades that followed. Because by the time anyone thought to record his story in detail, the man who had carried that original name was already gone, unmade and remade into something different. What remained was Sion. But before Sion, there was someone, a person, someone with a history that stretched back before the wars, before the violence, before the dark side got its hands on him and squeezed until something broke. He was strong. That much is certain from everything the surviving accounts suggest. In an era crowded with powerful Sith and experienced warriors, a period that produced an extraordinary concentration of Force-sensitive fighters on all sides of multiple conflicts, he distinguished himself enough to survive campaigns that destroyed countless others. He fought under the command of Revan's forces, and he learned the way all warriors learn in extended conflicts that grind on long enough that survival is not always a matter of skill or training or even raw power. Sometimes it is a matter of ruthlessness, of willingness, of a particular quality that is very hard to name but very easy to recognize when you see it across a battlefield: the refusal to stop. The wars ground on through the Outer Rim and deeper, The Mandalorians were fierce and disciplined, and they fought with the kind of cultural ferocity that made them genuinely terrifying in open engagement. Warriors who had been raised from childhood to understand combat as the highest expression of existence, for whom dying in battle was preferable to living in dishonor. The Republic forces under Revan's command had to match that ferocity or be destroyed by it, and matching it required the kind of sustained violence that changes people who participate in it, regardless of which side they are on. The man who would become Sion matched it. He absorbed punishment that should have taken him off the field and kept fighting. He survived engagements that killed everyone around him in conditions that left no rational explanation for why he specifically walked away. He was the kind of soldier that commanders notice and quietly begin to depend on and never entirely talk about. Because talking about it draws attention to how much of the burden is resting on one set of shoulders. And drawing attention to that is bad for morale on days when those shoulders are not available. But surviving the Mandalorian Wars intact was not something many people managed. And intact is perhaps not the right word for what the man who would become Sion managed either. The wars damaged him in ways that extended beyond the physical, beyond the accumulation of scars that all long-serving soldiers carry. Extended campaigns of that kind have a particular effect on the people inside them. They strip away everything that is not essential to killing and staying alive. And what remains after that stripping is rarely pleasant to look at from the outside. By the time the final phases of the Mandalorian Wars arrived, the warrior in question had become something harder and colder and more complete in its violence than the person who had originally marched off to fight. He had been shaped, the way metal is shaped by repeated heating and hammering, into something that fit violence comfortably, the way an old weapon fits a hand that has held nothing else for long enough. And then came Malachor 5. Malachor 5 is the kind of place that names itself in memory, that stamps itself on the consciousness of everyone who sees it in a way that does not fade, the way ordinary memories fade. A planet of twisted rock and perpetual storms, of ancient ruins that the dark side had soaked into across centuries until the very ground underfoot felt wrong, felt like something that was aware of you and not glad you had come. The Sith had left their mark on this world long before Revan's war brought armies to its surface. Dark side energy had saturated its atmosphere and its geology, and probably something deeper than either of those things. A quality of the place that pressed against the minds of Force users like persistent pressure behind the eyes, like a sound just below the threshold of hearing that you can almost but not quite make out. It was not a comfortable place. It was not designed or intended to be comfortable. It was a place where darkness had settled and hardened over a very long time. And the life that existed there had adapted to darkness the way life always adapts to whatever conditions it finds itself in. The final battle of the Mandalorian Wars was fought at Malachor 5, and it ended in a way that nobody who participated in it ever entirely recovered from. Not the survivors, not the witnesses, not the people who only felt the aftershock through the Force from light years away. Revan had a plan for the battle. He had been planning it for a long time, and the plan centered on a device that had been constructed specifically for this moment. A superweapon of a particular and terrible kind. It was called the Mass Shadow Generator. It did not destroy its targets from a distance the way conventional weapons do. It did something more intimate and more catastrophic than that. It manipulated gravity on a massive scale, using the planet's own mass shadow as the mechanism of destruction. The plan was to lure the Mandalorian forces into the gravity well and then activate the generator, and the competing gravitational forces would tear everything within range apart with a thoroughness that conventional weapons could not match. The plan worked. Measured by its stated objective, the destruction of the Mandalorian fleet, it was a complete success. The Mandalorian fleet was destroyed. The war ended. Mandalore the Ultimate died aboard his flagship as the gravitational forces tore it apart. The Mandalorian clans, broken and leaderless in a single moment, scattered across the galaxy to try to rebuild some kind of identity from the wreckage of everything that had defined them. But the mass shadow generator did not discriminate. It did not make distinctions between Mandalorian ships and Republic ships, between enemy personnel and friendly personnel, between the forces of the people who had built and activated it and the forces it had been built and activated to destroy. The gravitational catastrophe it created was not selective. It pulled everything in the area into its embrace with equal indifference, and the Republic forces who had gathered at Malachor 5 for what was supposed to be the final decisive victory found themselves caught in it just as surely as the enemy they had come to destroy. Thousands died. Republic soldiers who had survived years of grinding campaign, Jedi Knights who had followed Revan to war against the Council's wishes and paid for that choice in full. Everyone who had assembled at Malachor 5 for what was meant to be the end of the conflict found instead that the end had a much wider blast radius than anyone had said, and the dark side energy that had always saturated Malachor 5, that deep and ancient corruption that lived in the stone and the air and the force presence of the place, reacted to the mass death around it. The way the dark side always reacts to mass death. It fed, it grew, it expanded through the force, like a scream that had no upper limit, reaching every force-sensitive being within range and tearing through their connection to the living force, the way a blade tears through something that was never built to stop a blade. Force users who survived the physical devastation of the battle found themselves shattered in ways they could not explain or describe in words that made sense to people who had not been there. The wound in the force that Malachor 5 became on that day was real. It was lasting. It was a scar on the galaxy's spiritual landscape that persisted for years afterward, felt by force users across enormous distances as something that wasn't quite pain but wasn't anything else either. For the warrior who would become Sion, the Battle of Malachor 5 was not merely devastating. It was, in the most literal and complete sense of the word, fatal. His body was destroyed at Malachor 5. The exact nature of what happened to him, the specific sequence of injuries and their causes, is not something the surviving records preserve in clinical detail. Clinical detail was not the priority of anyone who survived that day in any condition to make records of it. What is known is that he died, or came as close to death as a living being can come while still retaining some shred of connection to the world. His body was broken in ways that should have been terminal. His connection to the Force, which had always been the thing that made him exceptional, the quality that separated him from ordinary soldiers, was in that moment both threatened and surrounded by energies that defied any ordinary understanding of how Force power works. Because Malachor 5 in that moment was drowning in dark side energy. The mass death had released it in quantities that had no precedent. Every life torn away by the gravitational catastrophe was releasing its force presence into the environment simultaneously, and the dark side was there to receive it all, amplifying and intensifying it until the force at Malachor 5 was something that barely resembled what Force users trained themselves to work with in ordinary conditions. It was more like pressure, more like a tide, more like something alive that had been waiting for exactly this kind of event and was now feeding on it with the uncomplicated satisfaction of something that has found what it was hungry for. A dying man in the middle of all of that. A warrior in enough agony to fuel a dozen dark side experiments, with a will that had been strong enough to survive everything the Mandalorian Wars had produced, and a rage that had been building across years of grinding, violent conflict until it had reached depths that most people, in most circumstances, would never come close to. What happened next is the thing that makes Darth Sion unique in the history of the Sith. Unique in the history of Force users altogether. Unique in the history of the galaxy. In the category of terrible things that living beings have done in moments of extremity. He refused, not in a philosophical sense, not in the way that Sith Lords sometimes speak metaphorically about refusing death, framing their ambition in dramatic language for the benefit of followers who respond to dramatic language. He refused in the most immediate and physical way possible. His body was shutting down. The systems that sustain life were failing in sequence, the way they always do at the end of a life, each one going dark as the resources that maintained it were no longer available. And something in him, some core of identity or will or sheer fundamental stubbornness that had survived everything else, rose up against the process and refused it. Not yet. Not here. Not like this. Not now. Not ever, if it could possibly be helped. The dark side answered him. It always answers in those moments. It is one of the things the dark side is best at, being present and available and responsive in the specific moments when a being is most desperate and most willing to accept what it is being offered without fully reading what the offer costs. The dark side does not come with conditions written in fine print. It comes in the moment of extremity, when the mind has been stripped down to its most fundamental components, and it offers the thing that every living creature, in its most desperate moment, wants more than anything else in existence. Continuation. Just continuation. The chance to keep going. Another moment. Another breath. Another heartbeat. The alternative to the long, cold dark that was right there, right on the other side of letting go. Sion took it. He took it completely, without hesitation, with both hands, and held on with everything that was left of him. And his body knit itself back together around the offer. Not cleanly. Not the way that healing is supposed to work. Not the way that even force-assisted healing works, where damage is repaired and function is restored and the body returns to something like what it was before. The bones reset wrong in places because there was no longer enough of what had been holding them in the right positions. The flesh reformed over trauma that had not finished expressing itself, layering new tissue over wounds that were still happening in some fundamental sense, still being processed by a body that could not keep up with the pace of its own damage. The result was something that lived, in the technical sense of that word, but that looked exactly like what it was. A man whose body had died and been dragged back through an act of will that the universe had not intended to accommodate. Every fracture in his bones remained, not sealed over and forgotten. The way healed breaks eventually become invisible on the inside of a living body. Present, filled with dark side energy the way cracks in stone can be filled with mineral deposits, held together by the same force that was simultaneously destroying him and maintaining him, the two processes running in parallel and in perpetual tension with each other. His skin split and reformed in patterns that followed the lines of old damage, because the damage was still there underneath, still active, still in progress. His eyes, exposed to energies during the mass death of Malachor 5, that no living being had been designed or intended to experience, changed into something pale and distant and wrong, in the specific way that things which have been present at catastrophic events are sometimes wrong afterward. He walked off the field at Malachor 5 as something new, something the galaxy did not have a name for yet. Though names would eventually come, the way names always come, for things that persist long enough to require naming. The Lord of Pain, Darth Sion, the undead Sith Lord, the thing that would not fall. And here is the thing that matters most about that moment. The thing that is very easy to overlook if you approach Sion's story as a simple horror narrative, a monster's origin and the eventual accounting that came for it. He knew what he had done. He knew what it cost. The dark side energy that held his body together did not provide anesthetic along with the structural support. It did not reduce or eliminate the pain of his physical state. If anything, and this is the particular cruelty of what he had chosen, it amplified it. The price of his continued existence was that every moment of that existence hurt. Every breath, every heartbeat, every step across every surface, every interaction with the air around him, with the clothes on what remained of his skin, with the weight of gravity pulling down on bones that had no business bearing weight. The body he had saved was a body in constant catastrophic failure, perpetually being destroyed and perpetually being rebuilt. And he felt every single instant of that dual process with a clarity that left nothing out. He had chosen to survive, and surviving meant choosing pain. Not once, as a decision made in a desperate moment and then left behind as the crisis passed. Every single day, every single hour, every moment in which he continued to exist was a moment in which he was actively, consciously choosing to endure the thing that his existence cost him, because the alternative was letting go, and letting go was the thing that was not available to him. That was not a choice he could make. Most people, placed in that reality after the first week of experiencing it, or the first month, would find the letting go happening on its own. The mind is not built to sustain indefinite torment. There are structural limits to what consciousness can endure before it begins to look for exits, before the clean mercy of true death becomes the only coherent remaining option, and the will bends toward it, the way a tree bends toward light. The fact that Sion did not reach those limits, the fact that the hatreds and the will that sustained him were sufficient to the task of sustaining him indefinitely, is the most frightening thing about him. Not the broken body or the relentless hunting or the inability to be killed by conventional violence. The most frightening thing is what it implies about the quantity of hatred and determination that was present, about what kind of person, shaped by what kind of experiences, could produce enough of both to fuel decades of the most painful form of continued existence the galaxy had ever produced. He was not a simple monster. Simple monsters are not frightening in the deep way. Darth Sion was something much more specific and much more unsettling than a simple monster. He was a person in whom something had gone catastrophically, irrevocably wrong, and who had responded to that catastrophe with the full force of everything he was, and found that what he was more than sufficient to continue. The period immediately following the Mandalorian Wars was one of the most unstable and violent in galactic history, a time when the wounds from one catastrophic conflict were still raw and the conditions for the next one were already being laid. Revan and Malak had defeated the Mandalorians. That victory should have been the end of a chapter and the beginning of something calmer. It was not. What it was, instead, was the transition into something darker and in many ways more terrible than what had come before it. Revan had followed his investigations into the source of the Mandalorian aggression all the way into the unknown regions, into the dark space at the edge of the known galaxy, where maps became uncertain and the Force itself felt different. What he found there had changed him in ways that went beyond the simple and familiar corruption of the dark side. He had encountered the Sith Emperor, a being whose name would eventually be recorded as Vitiate, whose story is its own separate and extraordinary nightmare, an entity of such immense and alien power that Revan, one of the most gifted Force users of his generation, had been captured and shaped and sent back into the galaxy as an instrument of a plan so long-term and so carefully constructed that its full scope would not be understood for centuries. Revan came back from the unknown regions as Darth Revan, Dark Lord of the Sith, with Malak at his side as Darth Malak. They brought a new Sith empire with them, forged in the war and the years of conflict that had built their skills and their following and their knowledge of Republic strategy and weakness. The Jedi Civil War erupted across the galaxy with a speed and ferocity that stunned a Republic that was still in the process of trying to recover from the Mandalorian conflict. Infrastructure had barely been rebuilt. Jedi casualties had barely been absorbed. The military was exhausted. The population was exhausted. And now the Republic faced an enemy that was, in the most deeply destabilizing way possible, built from itself. Republic soldiers who had followed Revan to war and returned, wearing a different allegiance. Jedi who had trained under the same masters and in the same temples, and now stood on the opposite side of every battle line. Sion moved through this period the way he moved through everything in the years after Malachor V, with the patience of something that cannot be worn down through attrition, because the thing that would have worn an ordinary being down had already happened, and he was still here, with the relentlessness of something that does not experience the fatigue and doubt and erosion of will that extended conflict, produces in beings who are still fully alive in the conventional sense. He participated in the violence of the era. He survived it without difficulty, in the sense that surviving had become trivially easy for something that could not die through ordinary means. He fought and hunted and persisted, but it was during the years that followed the Jedi Civil War, in the period of restructuring and shadow that came after Revan's eventual defeat and the collapse of Malak's Sith war machine, that Sion's story crystallized into the shape that history remembers. Because during those years, in the chaos and the reorganization of Sith power that followed the destruction of the previous order, he came to the attention of someone who would see in his particular horror not merely a weapon to be pointed at enemies, but a student, a project, a demonstration of something she had been thinking about for a very long time. Her name was Kreia, and before she became Darth Treya, she had been a Jedi. Specifically, she had been a Jedi historian, a scholar of the Force and its oldest and most complex teachings, a woman whose mind was one of the sharpest and most unconventional that the Order had produced in several generations. She had mentored Revan before his fall. That relationship, the fact of having been the primary teacher of the Jedi who became the Dark Lord who nearly destroyed the Republic, had followed her through the aftermath of the Jedi Civil War, like a shadow she could not step away from. The council had not formally charged her with anything. They had not found fault in her teaching, in any specific instruction she had given, in any choice she had made regarding the direction of his training. But the implication had been present quietly and persistently in every conversation, in every sideways look, in the specific quality of silence that falls in rooms where something is being carefully not said. The implication was that a teacher could be held responsible for what a student becomes, that the choices Revan had made reflected something about the instruction that had shaped him, that Kreia, however blameless the official record made her, was connected to the catastrophe in some way that a person of her intelligence and perception should have foreseen and prevented. She did not accept this. She had been thinking about the Force, about the Jedi and the Sith, and the entire framework of light and dark that she had spent her life studying, for long enough that her conclusions had become genuinely heretical in ways that went beyond simple dissatisfaction with the Council's decisions. She did not believe the Force was a clean binary of good and evil, of light and dark, of the simple moral arithmetic that both the Jedi and the Sith used as the foundation of their very different philosophies. She did not believe the Jedi's absolute prohibition on attachment and passion was wisdom. She suspected, with the precision of a very good mind that had been turned on a problem for a very long time, that it was fear wearing the costume of wisdom. And she had thoughts about what the Force did to the beings it claimed as its instruments. Thoughts that would have made any Jedi Master deeply uncomfortable if she had said them aloud in the council chambers. She did not say them aloud in the council chambers. She said them to herself, and then she left, cast out from the order she had served, and that had served her for the whole of her adult life. She did what exiles throughout galactic history have done when they find themselves on the outside of the institution that gave their existence shape. She looked for somewhere else to go, somewhere that would take her, with all of her heresies and her unconventional conclusions and her deep, abiding refusal to accept that either the Jedi or the Sith had the full truth about anything. She found the remnants of Revan's Sith, the survivors and stragglers and true believers who had scattered across the galaxy after the collapse of Malak's war machine. Fragments of a movement that had nearly succeeded and now existed in pieces, each piece trying to figure out what it was and what it was supposed to do now. She went among them not as a convert, not as someone who had arrived at the conclusion that everything the Sith believed was correct and everything she had previously believed was wrong. She went among them as a student of a different kind, with a scholar's willingness to sit with something she did not agree with in order to understand it fully. And it was there, among the ruins of Revan's Sith, in the dark and the chaos of the post-Civil War period, that she found Sion. What she found when she looked at him was not what most people found when they looked at the Lord of Pain. Most people looked at Sion and saw a horror, something broken, something to be feared and avoided. And ultimately, if circumstances forced the issue, destroyed, though the practical difficulties of destroying him were obvious to anyone who had tried. Kreia looked at him and saw something considerably more interesting than a horror. She saw a being whose relationship with the Force was unlike anything she had encountered in her decades of study. The dark side did not flow through Sion the way it flowed through other Sith Lords. It did not express itself in him as the ambition that drove Revan, or the consuming hunger that had already begun to hollow out what would become Darth Nihilus, or the rage-turned strategy that characterized most dark side practitioners at the height of their power. In Sion, the dark side had become something else entirely. It had become structural. It was the architecture of his continued existence, Not a tool he picked up and put down, but a fundamental component of what he was. Woven through him the way certain minerals are woven through certain kinds of stone, inseparable from the material they inhabit. Remove the dark side from Sion, and there would be nothing left. That was not a metaphor or an approximation. It was a literal description of his condition. The dark side was the only thing keeping the ruins of his body in their current configuration. Take it away, and the configuration would immediately cease to exist. And what had been Darth's Sion would finally, genuinely, completely be what it had technically been since Malachor 5, dead. To Kreia, whose entire intellectual life had been devoted to understanding the Force and the ways it shaped the beings who used it and were used by it. This was not merely interesting. It was extraordinary. It was a data point she had never had before. A being whose dependency on the Force had reached its absolute logical terminus. Sion was not a Force user. Sion was, in some very real and very strange sense, a Force condition. His existence was a demonstration of what the dark side would do when given a sufficiently damaged host and a sufficiently determined will to work with, left to develop without interruption for long enough. She found this philosophically fascinating in ways she did not entirely explain to Sion. Because Sion was not, by temperament or inclination, particularly interested in philosophy. What Sion was interested in was survival and power, and the expression of a rage that had been accumulating since before Malachor 5. Since the Mandalorian Wars and whatever had happened to him in them that had made the dark side such a natural fit, that had accumulated over the years since the catastrophe the way sediment accumulates in still water, layering and compressing until the depth of it was something that instruments could not easily measure. Kreia understood this. It would be more accurate to say that Kreia understood everything about Sion that could be understood through the particular kind of perception she had developed across a lifetime of reading people. She did not try to redirect his rage or moderate it, or convince him that he might feel differently about any of it if he thought about it from a different angle. She was far too intelligent for that kind of approach, and she had far too clear a picture of what she was looking at. She worked with what he was. She moved with the grain of him rather than against it. She offered to teach him, not the way Jedi Masters teach, through meditation and philosophy, and the careful cultivation of connection to the living Force. She had things that were more immediately applicable to what Sion was. Knowledge of Force mechanics and strategy, and the manipulation of people and situations and outcomes, the kind of sophisticated understanding of how power actually works that pure physical dominance has never required its possessor to develop. You do not need to understand the geometry of a trap if nothing can hold you. Sion had never needed to be subtle because subtlety is a tool for beings who can be threatened. He had never been threatened in any meaningful sense since Malachor 5, but Kreia could show him how to be more than a force of nature, how to be a force with a direction. And he was, beneath everything else, whatever else he was, smart enough to understand the value of that. He became her student, and she became, in the functional sense, if not quite in the emotional sense, his teacher. The relationship between them was not simple and was not warm in any ordinary understanding of warmth. Sion was not a being who generated warmth. The dark side energy that sustained him had a quality that people in his presence found uncomfortable in ways they often couldn't articulate precisely, a coldness that went beyond temperature into something more like the absence of the quality that living things project by virtue of being alive. And Kriya's warmth, such as it was, had always been the warmth of a strategist rather than of an ordinary person. She was capable of genuine feeling. She was also capable of using the appearance of genuine feeling as a tool when the situation called for it. And she was sufficiently intelligent and self-aware to know the difference between the two applications and to not entirely be sure, on certain questions, which category she was operating in. There was also something else, buried underneath the utility of the arrangement and the philosophical detachment on her side, and the barely contained fury on his, something that Kriya perceived with the same clarity she perceived everything, and that Sion did not perceive at all, because perceiving it would have required a kind of self-examination that his particular form of existence did not easily support. She saw, in him, beneath the horror of his physical condition and the immensity and depth of his hatred and the almost geological solidity of his determination to continue existing in defiance of everything that existence was costing him, something that she recognized from decades of teaching, from long experience of people at their most fundamental. She saw a being in pain who had never been offered an alternative, not the physical pain. She understood the physical pain perfectly well and had no illusions about its nature or its origin. The other kind of pain, the kind that lives deeper than the body, in whatever part of a person, is the actual center of them. The kind that does not have a precise name in any language, because most languages were not built to describe things that exact and that intimate. The kind that comes from having been seen as less than fully human for long enough that something inside starts to suspect the assessment might be correct. Whatever had shaped the warrior who had marched under Revan's banner and survived everything the Mandalorian Wars produced, there was something in that history that the dark side catastrophe of Malachor V had found and seized and amplified into the engine that now kept him moving. Kriya saw it. She had always been able to see those things in people. It was perhaps her defining gift, the thing she did better than almost anyone else in the history of the order she had left. And seeing it clearly meant she understood, with the precision of a very good mind, applied to a very specific problem, exactly what Sion was, and exactly what he needed, and exactly how those two facts could be used. She was a brilliant woman, brilliant and deeply, profoundly dangerous in ways that would not become entirely clear until much later, when the lessons she was teaching had been delivered and the full shape of her intentions had been revealed. But that revelation was a long time coming. In the period of her instruction of Sion, what was visible was the instruction itself, and by any measure, it was effective. Under her guidance, Sion became more than he had been. Not in the crude sense of becoming more powerful, though that happened too. More precisely, he became more capable. He had always been effective in the direct, physical sense of the word. Now, he became precise. He had always been impossible to destroy through conventional violence. Now he understood the specific mechanisms by which that impossibility functioned, well enough to maintain and reinforce them, to understand their limits and work within those limits strategically. He had always been strong in the dark side in his particular and terrible way. Now he had a framework for understanding that strength and deploying it deliberately rather than instinctively. They were not alone in their work. There was a third presence in what would eventually, formally, become the Sith Triumvirate. A third member whose nature was as distinct from Sion's as Sion's was distinct from anything the galaxy had produced before him. This third member had also been at Malachor V. The mass shadow generator's catastrophe had touched him too. But where Sion's response to the catastrophe had been to fill himself with hatred and hold himself together through the force of a will that refused to acknowledge any outcome other than survival, this third being had been hollowed out. The wound that Malachor 5 tore in him was not one that he had filled with something. It was a wound that had become the center of him, an emptiness, a hunger. His name was Darth Nihilus. And if Sion was the galaxy's most horrifying example of what the dark side could do to a body, Nihilus was its most complete and most terrifying example of what the dark side could do to a soul. Nihilus had survived the catastrophe at Malachor 5 by feeding on the force energy of the living beings around him as they died. Not intentionally, not as a choice made with understanding and intent, but as the reflex of something that was dying and found in the deaths around it, the sustenance to continue. And having done it once, having survived through that feeding, the mechanism had become permanent. He needed to feed. He needed to consume the force energy of living beings the way ordinary living beings need food and water. And the quantities required to sustain him made the ordinary understanding of that analogy completely inadequate. He had fed on outposts and settlements. He had fed on planets. He had approached concentrations of force-sensitive beings the way something enormous and patient approaches a food source. And he had drained the life from them completely, leaving worlds silent and empty and fundamentally wrong in the force. Places where the living presence that should have been there simply was not, consumed and gone. He moved through a mask and dark robes because the form beneath had ceased to be anything recognizable as a living being in any conventional sense. He was an appetite, an absolute and consuming and bottomless appetite that had, somewhere in the long years since Malachor 5, forgotten that it had ever been a person. He was not a Sith Lord in the way that term is normally understood. He was a catastrophe with a lightsaber. And even calling it that undersells how far beyond ordinary categories of dangerous he had gone. Kriya saw what both of them could be and what they could be together. She saw Sion as the hunter, the relentless and unkillable presence that could pursue individual targets with a persistence that no ordinary being could sustain or survive. She saw Nihilus as the instrument of mass destruction, capable of feeding on Jedi concentrations the way fire feeds on dry material, consuming them entirely and leaving nothing behind. Together, under her direction and working toward the goal she had been developing through the long, difficult years of her exile, they formed the foundation of something that the galaxy was not prepared for, the Sith Triumvirate. And its goal was not what Sith goals usually were. It was not conquest. It was not the seizure of political power or the imposition of Sith doctrine on a subject population. It was not even the defeat of the Republic. Though the Republic would certainly suffer in what was coming, the goal was extinction, not the extinction of the Republic or any political or governmental structure, the extinction of the Jedi Order, the complete, permanent, total elimination of the Guardians of the Light Side from the galaxy, executed with enough thoroughness that not even the knowledge of how to rebuild the Order would remain, so that what had been the Jedi would become a question mark in the historical record, a matter of uncertain legend, and eventually simply nothing, not even a memory. Kriya had reasons for wanting this that were more complicated than simple hatred. Her reasons went back to her expulsion from the Order and forward through everything she had thought since then about the nature of the Force and what it did to the beings it claimed as instruments and what the galaxy would look like if those instruments were removed and the Force was forced to find a different relationship with the life it flowed through. Her reasons were philosophical in the deep sense. They came from what she genuinely believed, however disturbing that belief was, about what would be good for the galaxy in the long term. Sion did not need reasons. He needed targets. The Jedi would do very well as targets. The period of rebuilding that followed the end of the Jedi Civil War had given the surviving Jedi something that, in retrospect, looks very much like a false sense of security. With Darth Malak dead and his Sith Empire disintegrating under the pressure of its own internal conflicts and the Republic's recovering military, the most immediate and visible existential threat appeared to have passed. The Order had taken losses during the Civil War that were genuinely severe, but it had survived. The Council was reconvening. The temples were beginning the careful, difficult work of gathering survivors and beginning to train the next generation from the inside, from the perspective of Jedi who had made it through the worst of it. The arc of events looked like it was bending back toward something manageable. It was not bending toward anything manageable. The worst was nowhere near past. The Jedi were about to discover this in ways that would reduce the Order from thousands to a scattered handful of survivors, hiding across the galaxy and questioning everything they thought they had understood about themselves and the Force, and whether the institution they served was capable of existing in a galaxy determined to eliminate it. The Triumvirate's campaign against the Jedi was nothing like what had come before. Revan and Malak had fought with fleets, with armies, with the full, visible apparatus of galactic warfare, campaigns that were devastating but that gave the Jedi something concrete and external to respond to, an enemy with a face and a location, and the kinds of weaknesses that could be found and exploited through combat and intelligence, and the qualities of force and strategy that the Jedi had always used to defend the Republic. The Triumvirate fought in the dark. They fought in the specific, quiet, patient dark of an extermination campaign that was designed to not look like a campaign at all. Sith assassins, trained specifically in techniques that allowed them to occlude their Force presence from detection, spread through the galaxy like something carried on the wind. Not dramatic, not visible. They reached places the Jedi believed were safe, locations they had not disclosed through any channel the Triumvirate should have had access to. They reached masters who were confident in their concealment. They reached young knights and Padawans whose only crime was being connected to the Force in a way that the Triumvirate had decided constituted a reason for them to die. The assassins were methodical. They were patient in the way that beings who are following a doctrine of thoroughness rather than a plan of escalation are patient, not rushing toward the conclusion but ensuring that each step is complete before the next one begins. And above and around their quiet, systematic work, Sion moved, not as an assassin. He had never been subtle, and his particular gifts did not reward subtlety or require it. He moved as the thing that finished what the assassin started, as the hunter, as the presence you ran from that could not be outrun because it would not stop, because it could not be hurt badly enough to make it stop, because you could turn and fight it and pour everything you had into the fight and bring it down and watch it fall, and then watch it stand back up again, and understand in that specific moment that everything you had spent had accomplished nothing, and it was still there, and it was still coming, and there was nothing left for you to do. One of the most powerful tools a hunter possesses is the despair of the hunted. The knowledge, cold and heavy and absolute, that escape is not possible. That resistance is not possible. That the only remaining variable is the timing of something that is no longer in question. Sion understood this instinctively. in the way that beings shaped entirely by violence understand things about violence, not through analysis but through long experience of what works and what does not work, and what the faces of people look like when they understand that what they are doing is not working. He had been there in those moments with many enemies over many years. He knew the specific expression. He understood precisely what it was worth. The Jedi began to disappear, not in the dramatic, visible way of open warfare, where the losses are documented and the battles are recorded, and the dead at least have the dignity of having been seen falling. They disappeared quietly, one at a time, in ways that sometimes left no evidence at all, nothing to find or to count or to report. A temple would go silent, a scheduled communication would not arrive, a beacon would stop transmitting, and the investigations sent to find out why would sometimes not come back either, or would come back with stories told in quieter voices than before, with eyes focused on something a little beyond the visible room. Because the words for what had been found did not exist yet in the vocabulary of people who were still alive. Among those stories, passed between the shrinking circles of surviving Jedi, in voices kept deliberately low, a name began to circulate, a title, the Lord of Pain, something that moved through the dark and could not be stopped, something that had fought Jedi Masters, some of the most capable fighters the Order had produced, and left them not dead in the simple, clean sense, but broken, exhausted, drained of the specific quality that makes a person capable of continuing to fight. Something that was patient, because patience was free to something that had nowhere to be and no deadline to meet. Something that was relentless, because relentlessness had become the only mode of existence available to it. Darth Sion, the Lord of Pain, the undead Sith Lord who walked through the galaxy on the ruins of a body that should have been left at Malachor 5, held together by hatred and dark side energy, and a refusal to accept death that had long since crossed the line between extraordinary willpower and something that did not have a name in any language the galaxy used for ordinary experiences. The Jedi Purge, as history would eventually name it, was a catastrophe without precedent in the long record of Jedi suffering. The Order that had stood for thousands of years, that had survived open wars and internal betrayals, and the destruction of its temples, and the corruption of its members, and the accumulated disasters of uncountable millennia, of being the thing that stood between the galaxy and its worst impulses, was being reduced. Not through open battle, where the Jedi could at least gather their remaining strength and face the threat with some of the collective force that their tradition was built for, through shadows, through isolation, through the hunting of individuals who had no way of knowing which of their refuges had already been found, which of their communications had already been compromised, which of their apparently safe sanctuaries had already been visited by something that they could not fight and that they could not outrun and that had all the time in the world. By the early 950s before the Battle of Yavin, the Jedi Order had been reduced to perhaps a dozen surviving members, scattered across the full breadth of the galaxy. 12 people carrying the traditions and knowledge and accumulated wisdom and responsibilities of an institution that had once numbered in the thousands, that had once been a presence in almost every corner of galactic life, that had once been the thing that the Republic looked to when it needed something that ordinary force could not provide. 12 people, most of them in hiding, most of them silent, most of them disconnected from the Force, in ways intentional or otherwise, because being connected to the Force during the Purge was what detection felt like from the inside, a brightness that the Triumvirate's instruments and assassins could find across enormous distances. Sion had participated in this reduction. He had hunted, and he had persisted, and he had demonstrated over and over again in encounters that became the shared nightmare of the surviving Jedi generation. Exactly what it meant to face something that your best efforts could not destroy, something that fell and rose and fell and rose, and that looked at you across the distance between its fall and its rising, with the patience of something that had decided, in a moment long before this one, that this was simply what it did, and that there was no alternative outcome available to either of you. He did not do this with pleasure. Pleasure was not easily available to a being in the constant and comprehensive agony of his particular form of existence, but with something, a grim and total satisfaction, perhaps, in the expression of the thing he was, in the fulfillment of the purpose that his continued existence had slowly, over the years since Malachor V, crystallized around, in being, in every encounter, the proof of the choice he had made in that moment when everything else was already gone. But the purge, thorough as it was not quite complete. One Jedi remained who had not been found, not because she was hiding in any conventional sense, though she had been moving through the Outer Rim for years in the undirected way of someone who does not have a destination because they do not have a purpose to travel toward. She had been nearly impossible for the Triumvirate to detect because she had been disconnected from the Force since Malachor V itself, since she had given the order to activate the mass shadow generator and felt, through her Force sensitivity, the deaths of thousands of people simultaneously, all at once, hitting her through the Force, like an impact that had no physical equivalent. The trauma of that moment had caused something in her to withdraw. Some essential part of her connection to the living Force had sealed itself off, the way a living thing seals off a wound that is too large to process all at once. She had been exiled by the Jedi Council for her part in the battle, for following Revan to war against the Council's instructions, for giving the order that ended the Mandalorian Wars in the specific catastrophic way that it had ended them. She had spent years in the Outer Rim, a former Jedi, with no connection to the Force and no connection to an order that had sent her away, moving through the galaxy as something between a ghost and a very skilled and very tired veteran trying to find something worth doing. Her name was Mitra Surik. She was called the Jedi Exile in most of the records that survived, and she was about to return to Republic space, drawn by distress signals and the slowly rebuilding threads of her connection to the Force, unaware of most of what had happened during her years of wandering, unaware of how few Jedi remained, unaware of what was waiting. And when Sion learned that she was coming, something happened in the architecture of his hatred that had not happened in a very long time. He became interested, not in the simple professional sense in which a hunter becomes interested in prey, calculating approaches and likely responses, and the most efficient path to the conclusion. He became interested in her specifically, in what she was, in the nature of her wound in the Force, which was different from his in its origin and its quality, but connected to the same catastrophe that had unmade him, in the fact that she had been there, at Malachor V, in the same moment that had created Darth Sion, and had survived it differently, had come out of it not as something held together by hatred, but as something that had simply let go, disconnected, drifted, and then, years later, begun to reconnect, begun somehow to find her way back toward what she had been, or toward some new version of it. He did not fully understand his interest. Self-examination was not a mode that was easily available to him, for the very practical reason that self-examination requires a degree of interior quiet that the constant agony of his existence did not permit. His interior landscape was not rich with nuance. It was rich with the specific and focused things that had sustained him since Malachor 5. And nuance was not among them, but Mitra Surik made it richer, made it more complicated, introduced something into the architecture of what he was that had not been there before, something that did not fit neatly into the existing structure, something that would need to be addressed, something that, without his being entirely aware of it yet, was already beginning to change the precise nature of the threat she represented to him. She was coming, and when she arrived, everything that the triumvirate had been building toward, the long, careful, patient work of years, was going to be tested in ways that none of its three members had entirely anticipated. Kriya had her plans, always 3 moves ahead, always operating with a clarity of vision about where things were going that her 2 students could not fully share. Nihilus was a force of nature, aimed at the living force wherever it concentrated, barely coherent as a being anymore, but devastating in his consuming, indiscriminate hunger. And Sion was a hunter who had just identified a quarry that interested him in ways that made the hunt more complicated than hunts usually were. The stage was being set, and at the center of it, patient in the way that only something with nothing left to fear from time can be patient, was Darth Sion, broken, held together by the hatred and the dark side energy, and the iron refusal to let go that had been sustaining him since the day the galaxy tried to kill him at Malachor 5 and failed, in constant agony, absolutely, inescapably, furiously alive. And the most important thing about him, the thing that his story is ultimately about, the thing that makes it more than a horror story and something closer to a tragedy of the deepest kind, was not yet fully visible. Not quite yet. It would become visible in what was coming, in the confrontations that none of the participants could yet see the shape of, in the moments when a woman who understood the Force differently than anyone Sion had ever encountered, who had survived the same catastrophe and come through it with a different kind of wound, would look at the Lord of Pain and see something that almost nobody else had managed to see. Not a monster, not a horror, not a weapon or a threat or an obstacle to be overcome through superior force or strategy. A prisoner, a person, a broken and suffering and terrible person. Yes, a person who had done terrible things and would do more. A person who had chosen his cage in the only moment when he had thought he had a choice, and had been living in it ever since, and had long since stopped being able to imagine that a door existed. Sion did not know this yet. He did not know that the person coming toward him through the galaxy was not just the last significant Jedi target remaining, not just the next entry on a list that had been growing shorter for years. He did not know that she would be the one to show him what he actually was, underneath everything he had constructed on top of it. He would learn, and learning it would cost him everything he had spent decades refusing to let go of. But that comes later. For now, the Lord of Pain walks in the dark between the stars. Every step costs him something that most living beings spend their whole lives never being asked to pay. Every breath is a choice made against the alternative. Every moment of his existence is a demonstration of something that the galaxy has never quite seen before and will, if it is fortunate, never quite see again. He keeps walking because stopping is not something he can do. Because stopping means the alternative, and the alternative means letting go. And letting go means that all of it, everything since Malachor 5, everything he has endured and inflicted and chosen, was for nothing, was just the long, painful delay of an ending that was always inevitable. And that is the one conclusion he will not accept. He keeps walking, the dark keeps answering, and somewhere in the outer rim, an exiled Jedi is pointing a ship toward Republic space, and she does not know yet what is waiting for her. She does not know that her return has already been noticed, that a pale, ruined, unkillable thing has already felt the shift in the force that her movement creates, already begun the slow and patient realignment of purpose that hunters perform when they have identified their next direction. She does not know any of this yet. She will. Mitra Surik arrived in Republic space, the way people who have been gone a long time and are not sure what they will find always arrive. Quietly, without announcement, with a kind of internal bracing that is not quite fear and not quite readiness, but something that sits between the two and borrows qualities from both. She had been in the outer rim for years. She had been moving without direction, in the specific way of someone who does not have a destination because they have not yet decided what they are moving toward, only what they are moving away from. The exile, the council's judgment, the memory of Malachor 5 and the order she had given, and the feeling arriving through the force like a wall of sound with no upper limit, of thousands of people dying all at once because she had made a choice. She had been moving away from all of that. And now, drawn by distress calls and the slow, cautious rebuilding of a force connection she had thought was permanently severed, she was moving back toward it. She did not know what the galaxy looked like now. She did not know how much had changed or been destroyed in the years of her wandering. She had heard fragments, the kinds of fragmentary information that reaches people in the outer rim through unreliable channels and second-hand accounts about the Jedi Civil War, about Revan and Malak, about the Republic's narrow survival. But the specifics of the purge, the systematic, patient, methodical work of the triumvirate, across the years she had been absent, had not reached her in any form she would have recognized as the true shape of the disaster. She was returning to a galaxy that had been quietly devastated in ways she was not prepared for. The Force was already reaching her as she approached, not the clear and bright connection of her earlier years, not the full, unimpeded flow of it that she remembered from before Malachor 5. Something more tentative than that, more careful, more like something that has been badly hurt testing weight on the injured part. Not yet trusting it with the full load, not yet sure whether the repair has held. But there, unmistakably, quietly, stubbornly there, and through it, in the way that the Force communicates things that cannot be communicated through any other channel, she felt something looking back. She would not have been able to describe it precisely. The Force does not always communicate in language. It communicates in the quality of things, in the specific texture of what attention feels like when it has been turned in your direction by something that has already decided it is interested in you. She felt that texture, and it was not the texture of anything she had felt in her years of wandering. And it was not comfortable. It was cold, in a very specific way. Not the cold of distance or absence, but the cold of something that is present and aware and regarding you from a place where warmth is simply not available anymore. She kept moving. She was not the kind of person who stopped moving when something frightening paid her attention. Years of surviving the outer rim on disconnected instinct and veteran skill had reinforced a quality that the Mandalorian Wars had first installed in her. The understanding that the direction toward the threat is almost always safer than the direction away from it, because the threat is already there, regardless of which way you face, and at least facing it gives you information. So she kept moving. And Sion watched her come. He had known she was returning before she crossed into Republic space. The Triumvirate's network of information was not purely a military or intelligence apparatus, though it had those qualities. It was also a force-sensitive network, a web of perception and awareness maintained by the dark side practitioners who served under the Triumvirate, attentive to exactly the kinds of disturbances in the Force that a returning Jedi exile, even one whose connection was damaged and partial and tentative, would inevitably produce. The Force does not conceal itself from those who know how to read it. It is not designed for discretion. It radiates from the beings who use it the way heat radiates from things that are hot. And the instruments that detected it had been tuned very specifically to the frequency of Jedi, of Force users, of anything that carried the quality of the living Force in its presence. Mitra Surik carried something stranger than that. She carried a wound, a genuine wound in the Force, a place where her connection had been severed in a way that was not quite healing and not quite permanent, something in between that did not map neatly onto any category the Triumvirate's instruments had been designed to detect. And because she did not map neatly onto those categories, she had been harder to find than most, but not invisible. Nothing that moved through the Force was entirely invisible to something that had been shaped by the dark side as completely and for as long as Sion had. He felt the particular quality of her, recognized in it the specific signature of Malachor V, the mark that the catastrophe had left on every being who had been there, himself included. That mark was unmistakable. It was the kind of thing you recognize, the way you recognize a scar on someone who was in the same accident you survived. The shape of a shared wound. He felt it, and he waited. Not in the way that patience is usually a strategy. A deliberate management of impulse in the service of a better tactical outcome. For Sion, waiting was not a management of impulse. Impulse is what living beings with ordinary existences experience. Impulse is what you feel when you want something to happen, and you have to resist acting on that want, because acting on it now would be suboptimal, and a later moment would serve better. Sion did not function on that timeline. He had been waiting, in various forms, since Malachor V. The specific additional waiting required by Mitra Surik's slow approach through Republic space was not a meaningful addition to anything he had already been doing. He simply continued to be what he was in the direction she was moving, and let the mathematics of trajectory do the rest. The mathematics of trajectory brought her to Perigus first. Perigus was a fuel mining facility. Isolated, utilitarian, the kind of installation that exists at the edge of inhabited space, because the things it produces are necessary, and the process of producing them is dangerous enough that nobody wants it anywhere near a populated world. It was there that Mitra Surik first regained consciousness after her transport had been caught in the aftermath of events she had not yet been awake to witness. It was there that she began the process of understanding what the galaxy had become in her absence. And it was there that Sion arrived. His arrival was not subtle. Subtlety had never been his instrument. He came to Paragus the way he came to everything, directly and completely, with the full weight of what he was projected ahead of him, in a way that force-sensitive beings in the facility felt before they saw him or knew what it was they were feeling. A coldness, a wrongness, the specific quality of the dark side when it has become something more than a power source and more than a philosophy, when it has become the literal physical substrate of a living being, and that living being is walking toward you through a pressurized corridor at the edge of inhabited space. The facility came apart around his passage, not because he was destroying it deliberately, though he was not particularly concerned about what he damaged in transit, but because the dark side radiates from Sion the way radiation radiates from certain materials, not intentionally, not aimed, but present and permeating and capable of doing damage to things that are not built to be in its immediate vicinity for extended periods. The systems at Paragus were not built for that. The people at Paragus were not built for that. The cold and the wrongness preceded him through the corridors, and the people who felt it respond to it the way living creatures respond to the approach of something that exists outside their category of normal threats. Not with the specific alert responses that danger triggers when it is recognizable. With something older and less structured than that, something that does not wait for cognitive processing before it starts moving the body toward the furthest available exit. Mitra Surik did not move toward the exit. She moved toward him. It was the first time he had seen her in person, had been close enough to her to read the specific quality of her force presence without the mediation of distance and the limitations of perception across vast space. And what he read was more complicated than he had expected, more than the Malachor 5 signature, more than the wound in the Force, more than the combination of those things with the unmistakable presence of a Jedi trained to the highest level of the Order's capacity before the connection was severed. There was something else, a quality that his long experience of Jedi targets had not previously encountered in quite this form. She was not afraid of him. Not in the way that most Jedi were not afraid of him, which was either the trained suppression of fear that Jedi discipline produced, a deliberate act of will overriding what the body and the instincts were doing below the level of conscious choice, or the specific and temporary absence of fear that came from not yet understanding what they were looking at, which corrected itself very quickly in his presence. Those things he recognized easily. He had seen them many times, from many different people, in many different stages of the encounters that had ended those people's careers as Jedi targets still alive and in the field. This was different. She looked at him with eyes that had not gone through the sequence of recognition and suppression and forced steadiness that he knew. She looked at him, and what he saw in her face was something more like assessment, a clear, steady, somewhat tired quality of looking at a problem and trying to understand it rather than simply trying to survive it. She was evaluating him, not his threat level in the crude tactical sense, though she was certainly doing that too. Something more than that. Something that involved looking at the totality of what he was, the broken body and the pale eyes and the dark side energy that radiated from him in waves that should have made everything in her nervous system point toward the exit, and trying to understand what had made it. He was not accustomed to being looked at that way. He was accustomed to being feared and fled and fought, and occasionally, in the cases of the most capable Jedi he had encountered, fought with a quality of skill and desperation that acknowledged exactly how seriously they were taking the threat he represented. He had never been assessed, had never been looked at by someone who was simultaneously maintaining functional combat readiness, and also, clearly and unmistakably, trying to understand something. They did not conclude their encounter at Perigus in the way that his encounters with Jedi targets usually concluded. The facility's deteriorating conditions and the specific complexity of what was happening there created circumstances that separated them before the full weight of what the encounter might have been could be realized. But the encounter left something behind in both of them. In Mitra, information, the first direct confirmation that the thing she had felt looking at her through the Force was real and present, and exactly as wrong as it had felt from a distance, along with something that was harder to categorize and harder to process while the immediate situation demanded attention. Something about what she had seen when she looked at him. Something she would need to think about when she had time for thinking, which was not now. In Sion, something harder to name. He had looked at her, and she had looked back. And the looking back had contained qualities he had not anticipated. The quality of being seen in a way that went past the surface of what he was. He was not certain he liked it. He was not certain he disliked it. He was certain that the hunting of Mitra Surik was not going to proceed in any of the ways that hunting usually proceeded, and that the deviation from the expected pattern was coming from her direction rather than from any change in him. He followed her. This is the part of the story that requires the most careful attention because it is the part that is most easily misread in the direction of its surface features and missed at the level of what is actually happening underneath them. The hunting of Mitra Surik across the worlds of the Outer Rim, and then through the Republic and ultimately to Malachor V and the Traeus Academy, is a pursuit. It is a predator following prey, the surface features of it. A Sith Lord tracking a Jedi across multiple star systems with patience and relentlessness, and the specific advantage of being impossible to kill, fit neatly into a category of narratives that the galaxy has produced many times across its long and violent history. The powerful dark side hunter and the resourceful Jedi target. That story exists. It has been told many times, but that is not the story of Darth Sion and Mitra Surik. Or rather, it is the container that the actual story is being carried in, and the container and the contents are not the same thing. Sion was hunting her, that is accurate. But the nature of his interest in her had been changing since Perigus, and the change was not something he had chosen or was even fully aware of as a process. It was happening at a level below conscious decision-making in whatever remained of the parts of him that operated without his deliberate direction. The dark side sustained his body. His hatred sustained his will. But underneath those things, in the parts of him that had survived Malachor V, in some form that the catastrophe had not fully reached or fully transformed, something else was running. He kept thinking about the way she had looked at him, not the tactical facts of the encounter. He processed those the way he processed all tactical information about targets, efficiently and without residue, integrating them into the understanding he built of her movement patterns and capabilities and the likely trajectory of her passage through Republic space, as she tried to piece together what had happened to the order she had left. That processing was clean and functional and exactly what it was supposed to be. The other thing was not clean, was not functional in any sense he had a name for, was not what it was supposed to be at all. He kept thinking about it, about the specific quality of her regard, about the fact that she had not been afraid, about the fact that what he had seen in her face in that first real encounter was something that, In the entire long span of his existence since Malachor 5, he had almost never encountered in the face of anyone who was looking directly at him and understood what they were looking at. Not pity, not the soft and slightly condescending quality that pity has, which he would have recognized instantly and reacted to with the contempt it deserved. Something harder than pity, and something that required more of the person feeling it. Something closer to recognition. The specific quality of being seen by someone who has been through something that, while not identical to your something, shares enough structural features that the person looking at you understands the shape of what it cost, even if they cannot fully know the specific cost in your specific currency. She had been at Malachor 5. She had felt the mass death through the Force. She had survived it differently than he had come through it into a wound rather than into a fortress, had spent years disconnected rather than years burning. But she had been there, and she carried that, the way he carried it, in a way that was not fully visible to anyone who had not been there, and was immediately recognizable to anyone who had. That recognition, that being seen in the specific context of the thing they shared, was doing something to him that he did not have language for because he had not had cause to develop language for it. Nothing in the long years since Malachor 5 had required him to understand this particular experience. Nothing had ever come this close to the actual center of what he was and looked at it with eyes that understood the geography without flinching and without looking away. Kreia noticed the change. Of course she did. Kreia noticed everything that was relevant, which was essentially everything. And the change in the quality of Sion's focus on the exile was immediately and obviously relevant. She had her own relationship with Mitra Surik that was developing in parallel to his, an infinitely more complex and layered relationship, one that involved teaching and manipulation and genuine feeling, and the specific cruelty of someone who loved in a way that expressed itself as control, because control was the only mode of connection she had developed the capacity for. But she noticed what was happening with Sion, and she filed it in the very large internal archive of information she maintained about everything around her, available for use at the moment when using it would serve her purposes most efficiently. She had shaped him. She had taken the wreckage that had walked away from Malachor 5 and built it into something with direction and capability, and a place in the architecture of the Triumvirate's work. She understood him in the way that a sculptor understands the material they have been working with for years, its strengths and its fracture lines, and the places where too much pressure will split rather than shape it. She understood that what was happening in him with regard to Mitra Surik was not a tactical vulnerability, in the simple sense of the word, not the kind of thing that an enemy could exploit in a straightforward way to neutralize him as a threat. It was something more complicated than that, something that could not be addressed through adjustment of his orders or redirection of his attention. She let it continue. She had her reasons, as she had reasons for everything. Some of those reasons were about the broader game she was playing, moves she was making at a level of strategic depth that neither Sion nor Nihilus were ever fully invited to see. But some of them, and this is the part of Kreia that makes her one of the most complicated figures in this entire era of galactic history. Some of them were simply that she saw in what was happening between Sion and the exile something that she could not entirely bring herself to stop, something that touched the part of her that was still, despite everything, a teacher, that still recognized in a student the specific signs of encountering something that might, if the conditions allowed it, teach them something that she herself had not been able to give them. She let it continue, and Sion kept following. Mitra Surik was rebuilding herself as she moved. This is the thing that made her journey through the mid-game of this story so extraordinary and so consequential. She was not merely surviving the galaxy that the Purge had created. She was learning it. She was gathering people around her, Force-sensitive beings whose connections had been damaged or suppressed in various ways. And through those connections, she was relearning what it meant to be what she was. Not in the formal institutional sense of the Jedi Order's training, not the structured curriculum of the temples, but in the older and more fundamental sense of what force sensitivity actually means when you strip away everything that has been built around it over centuries of doctrine and tradition. She was learning to feel it again, to trust it, to allow the Force to move through her the way it was meant to move through beings who carry it, not as a tool being deliberately wielded, but as a current being navigated, something larger than the individual that the individual participates in without being fully subordinate to it. Every person she encountered who carried that quality taught her something. Every world she passed through and engaged with fully, rather than using as a waypoint on the route to somewhere else, deepened her understanding of what she was returning to and what the return required of her. And Sion followed all of it, watched all of it from the distance of someone who is maintaining operational awareness of a target, while also, simultaneously and involuntarily, being affected by the thing the target is doing. He could not do what she was doing. The nature of his existence since Malachor 5 had closed off the particular kind of growth she was engaged in as completely as it had closed off the ordinary experience of being alive without constant agony. She was reconnecting. He had not been connected in any sense the word could comfortably carry since the catastrophe. The dark side that sustained him was not a connection to the Force in the way that Jedi or even ordinary Sith talked about connection. It was a dependency, a fundamental physiological dependency on a particular and destructive expression of Force energy. Connection implies a kind of reciprocity. What Sion had with the dark side was not reciprocal. He consumed it, and it consumed him. And the only question was, which process would outlast the other? He watched her reconnecting, and he felt, through the specific and strange perceptual apparatus that the dark side had given him since Malachor 5, the quality of what she was building. And it was unlike anything he had been in proximity to since before the catastrophe. Not since the period before the wars, before the campaigns, before the grinding attrition of extended violence had stripped away everything that was not absolutely essential to killing and surviving. Not since whatever the man who had eventually become Sion had been before, all of that had started. She was building something that he had lost so long ago that he had forgotten he ever had it. He did not have a name for what it was. He would not have been able to articulate the lack of it, even if someone had asked him the right question in the right way, and given him enough time to search through the long rubble of himself for an answer. The dark side does not illuminate things about the inner landscape of those who have given themselves to it. It clarifies the things it values: anger, hatred, the will to survive and dominate and endure. Everything else goes dark, but he felt the quality of what she had. He felt it the way a person with no warmth in them can still feel warmth radiating from something close by. Not as comfort, not in any way that he could have described as pleasant or good, but present, real, undeniable. Something that he was registering in a register he had not expected to still be operational in him. Their second major confrontation came at the Traeus Academy on Malachor 5. He had been there before her. The Triumvirate had established the Traeus Academy as its operational base for reasons that were partly strategic and partly something that Kreia understood more fully than she explained to her students. The dark side energy of Malachor 5, the residue of the mass death that had poisoned the place years before, was useful in ways that a base located somewhere less thoroughly saturated could not have been. The dark side was stronger there than almost anywhere else in the known galaxy. Practicing in it was like training in high gravity. Everything became harder, and the difficulty produced a kind of strength that easier conditions could not replicate. The Academy served as the Triumvirate's training ground, its command center, its library of dark side knowledge, and the final destination toward which the whole structure of the Purge had been building. Mitra Surik came to Malachor 5 because she had to. The logic of her journey led there the way all the streams of a river system lead to the same water eventually. Because Malachor 5 was the source of what the Triumvirate had done, and the source was where the resolution had to be sought. She had fought her way through the consequences of the Purge. She had survived encounters with Sith assassins and with the network of Force-sensitive beings that the Triumvirate had deployed across the galaxy. She had rebuilt her connection to the Force and rebuilt her community of companions and rebuilt enough of herself to face what was waiting. The planet received her the way it received everything, with the cold and the wrongness and the pressing weight of dark side energy that had nowhere to discharge because there was no light side presence of sufficient strength on the planet's surface to balance against it. The storms that perpetually surrounded Malachor 5 were not purely meteorological phenomena. They were force conditions expressed in weather. The dark side energy finding a channel in the atmosphere and the geology and moving through both in ways that felt angry, felt purposeful, felt like something that was aware of the living beings walking on its surface, and was making a judgment about their presence that was not favorable. Mitra Surik walked into it. She had walked into worse. Sion was waiting, not at the Academy's entrance, not in any of the obvious places that a being who wanted to stop someone from progressing would choose if the goal was simply to stop them. He was waiting in a location that was tactically interesting but more significantly was meaningful in the specific and personal way that places can be meaningful to individuals, for whom the place carries the weight of formative events. He was waiting somewhere that Malachor 5's particular darkness was thickest, where the resonance of the mass death that had unmade and remade him was loudest, where the dark side energy that sustained him was most concentrated and most immediately available. He was waiting somewhere that was, in every sense that mattered, his ground. A place where everything about the environment worked in his favor and nothing worked in hers. She came anyway. What happened between them in that first confrontation on Malachor 5 defies the simple narrative of a fight between opponents. It was that, on the surface, lightsabers, force powers, the full engagement of two beings at the highest level of combat capability available to a person in the Star Wars galaxy, one of whom had been rebuilt by the dark side into something that could not be destroyed through conventional violence, and one of whom had been through enough in the years of her exile that the word formidable did not fully cover what she had become. But underneath the combat, something else was happening. She kept talking to him, not in the way that people talk during a fight to distract or to intimidate, or to gather information by watching which words land differently than others. In the way that someone talks when they have decided that what is happening is not fundamentally a fight. even if it is expressing itself as one, in the way that someone talks when they believe, with the specific clarity of a person who has been paying very close attention to something for a long time, that the most important thing they can do in this moment is not win the physical confrontation, but reach whatever is on the other side of the physical confrontation. She talked to him like he was a person, specifically, like he was a person she had been trying to understand and had made some progress on, and was now going to test her understanding against the reality of him, while simultaneously defending herself against the reality of him. He knocked her back. He rose. He fell and rose again, in the way he always fell and rose. The dark side, knitting the damaged places back together in real time, with the practiced efficiency of something that has been performing that function for decades. He was stronger here, on Malachor 5, in the heart of the dark side saturation, than he had been at any of their previous encounters. The energy that sustained him was most abundant here, the conditions most favorable, and she kept talking. She talked about Malachor 5, about what had happened there. Not the tactical history of it, not the military analysis of the mass shadow generator and its effects on the Mandalorian fleet, the personal history, what it had been like to be there, what the Force had felt like in the moment of the catastrophe, what it felt like to carry the weight of the order she had given and what it had taken from her, and what the years since had been, the wandering and the disconnection and the long, slow, tentative process of returning to herself. He had not expected her to talk about that. He had not anticipated that anyone, in any circumstances, would look at the Lord of Pain in the middle of a combat engagement on the most dark side saturated planet in the known galaxy and choose that moment to talk about what Malachor 5 had cost them personally. The tactical logic of it was, from a conventional perspective, essentially zero. The emotional logic of it, the specific emotional logic of a person who had decided that the most important thing she could do in this moment was to be honest about something true, made a different kind of sense that he was entirely unprepared for. She told him she understood what had happened to him. Not that she felt sorry for him, not that she forgave him for the things he had done, which were not things that forgiveness could address in any simple or comfortable way. That she understood, that she had been at the same place in the same moment, and that the same event had done different things to both of them, and that she had spent enough time thinking about what it had done to him, this person she had spent months being hunted by, that she thought she understood the shape of it. Not all of it, but the shape. He fell again, and he rose again, and she kept talking and fighting, and there was something happening in the quality of his rising that was not what his rising had been in previous encounters, a quality that had not been there before, a roughness, not in the physical sense, though the physical was certainly present and brutal and exhausting, but in the sense of something that was meeting friction that it had not met before, something that was encountering resistance not from an opposing physical force, but from within its own structure. She talked about what holding on cost, about what she had seen in him from the first moment she had perceived that something was looking at her through the Force in the weeks before Perigus. She talked about the quality of his presence, the thing that was dark and cold and wrong in the specific way that something wrong for a very long time eventually becomes, a wrongness that has had years to settle into its final shape and harden there. And she said, with the directness of someone who has decided that this specific moment is the one where the truth is necessary regardless of what the truth costs, that what she felt when she felt him through the Force was not only the horror of what he had become, that underneath the horror, in the place that the dark side had not fully reached or fully colonized or fully converted into the architecture of his continued destruction, she felt something that she recognized. She felt someone in pain who did not know that they were allowed to stop. This is the moment. In the long and terrible and extraordinary story of Darth Sion, this is the moment that everything has been building toward. Not the combat, not the force powers or the dark side strength or the relentlessness of the hunting or any of the impressive and horrifying external features of what he was. This moment, this specific thing that she said to him, in this specific place, while they were both bleeding and the dark side energy of Malachor 5 was pressing down on both of them from everywhere at once. He did not fall this time. He stayed standing. And he looked at her, and for a moment, the quality of what was in the pale and ruined eyes shifted, not dramatically, not in the way of dramatic transformations that announce themselves loudly enough to be visible from the back of a crowd. In the specific, private, barely perceptible way that a shift happening at the very deepest level of a person expresses itself on the surface, when the person has been carrying the thing being shifted for so long that they have no practice at displaying what the absence of it feels like. He had been sustaining himself on hatred and pain for decades. The hatred of his enemies, the hatred of his circumstances, the hatred of the death he had refused, and the world that had tried to impose it on him. The pain that had never stopped for a single moment since Malachor 5, that had become so fundamental to his experience of existing that he had long since stopped experiencing it as a thing that was happening to him and started experiencing it simply as the baseline texture of being alive, or whatever it was that he was doing that served him instead of being alive. She had named it. She had looked directly at the thing at the center of him, and named it not as power, not as strength, not as the impressive and frightening will that had sustained him through the impossible. She had named it as pain, just pain, the kind that hurts the person feeling it and does not transform into something noble by virtue of having been endured for a long time. Just ongoing, continuous, foundational pain. And she had said he was allowed to stop. The word allowed is the important word. Not that stopping was possible, though she believed it was. Not that stopping would be easier, because nothing about what stopping would require was easy. That he was allowed. That permission existed somewhere in the universe for the thing that he had been too entrenched in his own refusal to consider asking for since Malachor 5. The permission to let go, to let the body that had been rebuilt by hatred fall and not rise, to let the force that had been sustaining him in agony for decades finally be released from the particular service it had been performing, so that it could return to the larger flow of things from which his desperate grip on it had been keeping it apart. He fell. It was different from every other time he had fallen during their encounter. Every other time he had fallen there had been a quality of continuation in it, a temporary interruption in the momentum of something that intended to resume. This time, there was not. This time, the falling had the quality of a conclusion rather than a pause. A period at the end of a very long sentence rather than a comma. He rose. This is the part that is most important to understand. He rose. He was not done yet. The hatred and the will and the decades of practice at refusing the only alternative available to him did not dissolve in a single moment of being seen and spoken to honestly by someone who understood the shape of his wound. It was not that kind of story, and Darth Sion was not that kind of person. What Mitra Surik had done was not cast a spell that resolved his condition instantaneously. she had introduced a crack, a fracture, in the specific and narrow sense of something that has been under too much structural stress for too long, and finally found the precise application of force that it was susceptible to. He rose and he spoke. And what he said, in the voice of something that had been existing without ordinary human comfort or ordinary human connection for so long that the mechanics of speech felt strange in a new way, was something that the surviving records do not preserve in clean detail. What they preserve is the shape of it. He said that she was right. He said that it hurt. He said, in the way of someone who has been waiting so long to say a true thing that the saying of it costs them everything they have left, something about the quality of what it had been, the endurance of it, the choice of it. The way the choice had felt necessary at the time, in the moment, at Malachor 5, when the alternative was simply not available, and the way the necessity had extended itself across the years that followed until the distinction between choosing it and being trapped in it had become impossible to locate. He fell again. This time, the quality of the falling was different from anything that had come before it in all the long years since Malachor 5. It had the quality of surrender in it, but not the surrender of defeat, not the collapse of something that has been overcome by a superior force. The surrender of something that has been fighting for a very long time and has finally, in this specific moment, been given a reason to believe that the fighting is optional, that stopping is permitted, that the permission has always been available somewhere. And the only thing preventing him from finding it had been that he had never known where to look, and no one had ever thought to tell him. She was still there, standing in the dark and the storms of Malachor 5, bleeding from the engagement, holding the force around her with the careful, deliberate attention of someone who has been rebuilding their connection to it for long enough to know how much they depend on it and how important it is not to take it for granted. She was still there, and she was watching him, and what was in her face was not triumph, was not the satisfaction of a combat objective achieved, or an enemy neutralized, or a tactical situation resolved in the expected direction. It was something much harder and much more human than any of those things. It was grief for him, for what he had been and what he had become, and what it had cost him to sustain the becoming for as long as he had. For the decades of agony chosen in the only moment when choosing felt like the only option, and then sustained past the point where the original logic of the choice still applied. For the person whose name history had not preserved, who had marched under Revan's banner in the Mandalorian Wars and survived everything that war produced and then survived Malachor 5 in the worst possible way, rebuilt in hatred and pain into something that would hunt Jedi through the long, dark years of the Purge and call itself Lord of Pain, as though the naming of the thing gave it a dignity it could not find elsewhere. She grieved for him, with the specific and unsentimental grief of someone who understands what they are grieving for and does not flinch from the full weight of it, including the weight of the terrible things he had done and the people he had ended and the role he had played in the purge that had brought the order to the edge of extinction. She did not grieve for a misunderstood innocent. She grieved for a person who had been in pain for so long and so completely that they had lost access to any version of themselves that existed before the pain. She grieved for the loss of a person who had never had a chance to be fully what they might have been before the wars. Ground them down into the thing that Malachor 5 could make a weapon of. The dark side energy that had been sustaining Sion for decades began to release. Not all at once, not with dramatic, visible effect, but the specific quality of the Force presence in the immediate vicinity of where he lay shifted, the way a very dense concentration of dark side energy shifts when the will that has been directing it begins to relax its hold. The bones that had been held together by hatred and dark side intensity for so long they had forgotten how to hold themselves together any other way began to settle into their final configuration. The flesh that had been perpetually in the process of both failing and reforming, that dual process that had sustained him in agony for decades, slowed. And then slower. And then slower than that. He spoke again. The records that have come down to us from this period are fragmentary and compromised by the chaos of what happened on Malachor 5 in the hours that followed this encounter. But what has been preserved suggests that his final words were not about hatred, were not about the Force or the Sith or the Triumvirate or any of the large external things that had provided the architecture of his existence since the catastrophe. They were simpler than any of those things, and more personal. Something about being tired, after decades of an existence that was entirely constituted by the management and the expression of the agony of continuing to exist. He was tired. The word does not capture it fully. No word captures it fully. But it was the closest available approximation. The closest the vocabulary of ordinary experience could come to describing what it felt like to finally, after all of it, be approaching the possibility of stopping. He died on Malachor 5, in the place where he had died the first time and refused it. He died in the place where everything had begun. There is a completeness to this that is either cosmic justice or coincidence, depending on your relationship with the Force and its tendency to express itself through the symmetry of events, rather than through the clean moral arithmetic of conventional reward and punishment. He had refused death at Malachor 5 decades earlier and become the thing that the refusal made him. He accepted it at Malachor 5 and became, in the only way still available to him, what he had always been, underneath everything else that had been built on top of it. Just a person. A broken and terrible person who had done things that are not excused by the fact of his suffering. The Jedi he had hunted, the people who had died in the systematic work of the Purge, the damage done to the Order and to the galaxy through the decades of the Triumvirate's work he had been an essential and willing instrument of. None of that is dissolved by the manner of his death, or by the compassion that Mitra Surik brought to the encounter that ended him. The damage was real. The dead were dead. History does not revise those facts because the person responsible for participating in them turned out to have been in extraordinary pain. But the manner of his death matters. It matters for the specific reason that it tells us something true about what he was, underneath everything. It tells us that the thing which finally ended the Lord of Pain was not a lightsaber, was not a superior application of Force power, was not some technical exploit discovered by a clever enough tactician who had worked out the mechanics of his immortality and found the gap in it that a conventional weapon could fit through. What ended Darth Sion was being seen, being told that stopping was permitted, being shown by someone who shared the same catastrophic origin point and had survived it differently and was therefore uniquely positioned to make the argument with full credibility that the pain he had been sustaining himself on was not the only available relationship with the Force, not the only possible response to the thing that Malachor 5 had done, that the wound could be, if not healed exactly, then at least rested. That resting was not failure, that the will to survive which had been one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of sheer force of self that the galaxy had ever produced, was not required to be permanent. That it was enough that he had done it. That it was enough. This is what makes Darth Sion the most disturbing figure in Star Wars legends. Not the body horror, not the relentlessness, not the ability to survive things that should have been terminal. All of those things are frightening, but they are frightening in the surface way. The way that threats are frightening. The way that monsters are frightening. Something to be faced and overcome, and then set aside when the story is over. What makes Sion genuinely disturbing, in the deep and lasting way, is the implication he was a person. A person who had been through something catastrophic and had responded to it with the full force of everything he was, and what he was more than sufficient for the response, and he had sustained that response for decades at a cost that defies ordinary comprehension. And underneath all of it, at the very bottom of it, below the hatred and the dark side dependency and the broken bones and the pale eyes and the centuries of horror, was someone who was simply in pain and did not know that stopping was an option. That is not a comfortable thought. It is not supposed to be. The comfort of the simple monster is that the monster is external to you. It is something fundamentally unlike you that you can face and overcome and put behind you. The discomfort of Darth Sion is that his story does not stay external. It comes inside. It asks a question about the nature of what people do when they are in enough pain and have enough will and are given, in a terrible moment, the wrong options. It asks a question about what survival costs when the form survival takes is chosen in extremity and then sustained past the point where the original reasons for the choice still apply. About what happens when the thing that saved you becomes the thing that is destroying you. And the two processes are so entangled that you cannot find the line between them anymore. His story is not a hero story. He was not a hero. His story is not a simple villain story either, though he did villain's work throughout his existence in the era of the Triumvirate. His story is something more uncomfortable and more honest than either of those categories. It is the story of what happens when someone is broken in a particular way, and the broken state becomes so fundamental to who they are that the breakage is indistinguishable from identity. When the coping mechanism becomes the self. When survival and suffering become synonymous. The Star Wars universe is populated with powerful and memorable dark side figures. Lords and emperors and hand-picked apprentices. Beings of immense power and sweeping ambition, and the specific kind of darkness that comes from choosing the wrong thing with full awareness of the choice and committing to it completely. Most of those figures are frightening because of their power, because of what they are willing to do, because of the scale of the damage they are capable of and willing to inflict. Sion is frightening for a different reason. He is frightening because he is recognizable, not in the details. The details of his experience are extreme to the point of being alien. Nobody reading or watching or listening to his story has had their body destroyed and rebuilt by dark side energy and sustained in agony for decades by the force of their own refusal to die. That specific experience is not recognizable because it is not possible in the ordinary world. But the shape of it is recognizable. The shape of having been through something so catastrophic that you remade yourself around the surviving of it, and then found that the remaking had become permanent, had become who you were. and that you could no longer easily locate the person who existed before the catastrophe, because that person is so thoroughly buried under everything that was built on top of them. The shape of sustaining something painful because stopping feels like failing. The shape of having chosen, in a moment of extremity, a form of survival that cost more than you could have known it would cost, and then found yourself committed to paying that cost indefinitely, because revisiting the choice felt impossible. The shape of being in pain so deep and so continuous that you have stopped experiencing it as an event and started experiencing it as a condition, as the fundamental background of your existence, the thing that was just there. Those shapes are recognizable, and Mitra Surik's recognition of them, her willingness to look at the most extreme possible expression of those patterns in the broken body of the Lord of Pain and say, "I see this. I know this shape. I understand what this is, and I am not afraid of it," is the act that makes her one of the most remarkable figures in this entire era of galactic history. Not her combat capability, not her survival of the Purge, not even her success in ending the Triumvirate and preserving what remained of the Jedi Order and the conditions for its eventual rebuilding. Her willingness to see Sion as a person when seeing him as a person was the most counterintuitive thing available to her. And also, it turned out, the most powerful. The dark side offers many things: power, endurance, survival at any cost, the ability to sustain yourself on the worst things that can happen to you and turn them into fuel. It offers all of those things, and it delivers on most of them in the specific and costly way that the dark side delivers on its promises, which is to say completely and at a price that you could not have fully understood when you accepted the offer. What the dark side cannot offer is relief, cannot offer rest, cannot offer the particular and fundamental thing that Mitra Surik gave Darth Sion in his final moments at Malachor 5, which was permission. The dark side does not give permission to stop. It does not have that in its inventory. It sustains and intensifies and demands more, always more. More rage and more pain and more will and more of whatever you are running on. And it gives you the strength to keep going in exchange. And it never quite gets around to explaining that the strength to keep going and the permission to stop are not the same thing and cannot be obtained from the same source. He found the permission from the least expected direction, from a Jedi, from the person he had been hunting across the galaxy, from someone who shared his wound and had found a different way of carrying it, from someone who looked at the horror he had become and did not see only the horror. There is a version of the story of Darth Sion that ends with his first death at Malachor 5 and the dark side's answer to it. That version is the story of a powerful and terrible weapon being forged in catastrophe. There is a version that ends with his decades of hunting and the systematic work of the Purge. That version is the story of a monster operating at the height of its capacity. The version that matters is the one that ends in his second death at Malachor 5, when the Lord of Pain finally chose to lay down the thing he had been carrying since the first death, when the will that had sustained the impossible finally, quietly, completely let go. That version is a tragedy, a genuine one, not the theatrical tragedy of noble figures brought low by hubris or fate, the quiet human tragedy of a person who suffered immensely and caused immense suffering and never quite, until the very end, knew that the choice he had made in the worst moment of his existence was not the only choice available to the person he might have become. Malachor 5 went quiet in the Force when he died. Not immediately. not dramatically, but in the way that a sound goes quiet when the source of it stops, gradually and then completely, leaving a silence that is more than the absence of the sound, that carries the quality of the sound within it as a kind of echo that slowly fades. The dark side energy that had sustained him for decades dispersed back into the planet's already saturated environment, which swallowed it without visible effect. Because Malachor 5 had been absorbing dark side energy for centuries, and one Sith Lord's worth more, however extraordinary the source, was not enough to meaningfully change what the place was. But for a moment, in the immediate vicinity of where Sion had finally allowed himself to fall and not rise, the force was different. Lighter. Though lighter is not quite the right word, because light implies the presence of something. And what happened was more like the removal of something that had been pressing down for a very long time. A pressure releasing. A held breath let out. The specific quality of a thing that has been in sustained effort finally reaching the state it was working toward. The completion that the effort was always in service of. The Lord of Pain was gone. Darth Sion, the undead Sith Lord who had walked through the galaxy on the ruins of his own corpse for decades, held together by hatred and dark side energy, and the most extraordinary demonstration of sheer will the galaxy had ever produced, was gone. What remained was the silence, and the storms, and the dark side energy, settling back into the familiar patterns of a planet that had known nothing else for a very long time. And Mitra Surik, still standing, breathing in the dark, grieving for something that was not easy to grieve for, and doing it anyway, because she had looked at the thing and seen a person inside it, and that meant the grief was real, and the grief deserved its moment, regardless of what it cost her to give it. She had things to do. The triumvirate was not finished. Darth Treya remained at the heart of the Treyas Academy, with her plans and her philosophy and the specific and devastating intelligence that had constructed the whole terrible architecture of the Purge, and was now prepared to see it through to its conclusion. That confrontation was still ahead. The work was not done. She turned away from where Sion had fallen, and Malachor 5 received its dead back into the darkness, the way it had always received them, the way it would continue to receive them, with the cold and the patient indifference of a place that has seen so much of both life and the ending of it that it has stopped making distinctions between the two. The story of Darth Sion is over, but the question it asks does not end with him. It persists, in the way that the most honest questions persist, outlasting the specific circumstances that produced them, continuing to be relevant in contexts the original story never anticipated. The question of what people become when they survive catastrophe in the wrong way, what they carry forward, what the survival costs them and the people around them, what it would take in the long chain of events that leads from the catastrophic moment to whatever follows it. To give someone the specific and difficult gift that Mitra Surik gave Darth Sion at the very end. The gift of being seen, of being recognized as a person, even inside the horror, of being told that the pain is real and the endurance of it was real, and that stopping, finally, truly, completely stopping, is permitted. The dark side has many students. It offers them many things. It shows them power and endurance, and the ability to sustain themselves on the worst of what the galaxy has in it. It builds them into remarkable and terrible things. It does all of this, and it does it efficiently. And the beings it builds are genuinely frightening, genuinely capable, genuinely worthy of the names that history gives them. But it never tells them that they are allowed to rest. That remains the province of something else. Something that requires the kind of courage that Mitra Surik demonstrated in the heart of Malachor V, surrounded by dark side energy and the ruins of a Sith Lord's decades-long refusal of the ordinary mercy of death. The courage to look at something that is doing terrible things and choose, in that specific moment, to see the person who might be inside the terrible thing, to say the name of the pain, to offer the permission. It does not always work. Most of the time, in the long history of the galaxy and the long history of the dark side and the many beings who have given themselves to it in moments of extremity, it does not work. The hatred runs too deep, or the will is too fixed, or the moment never arrives when the fracture that Mitra Surik found in Sion is accessible in a way that honesty can reach. But at Malachor V, with the Lord of Pain standing in the dark and the storms of the place that had made him, it worked. And that is the most frightening and the most beautiful thing about the lore of Darth Sion. Not that he was unkillable, not that he was horrifying, not that he was the most successful product of the catastrophe at Malachor V, sustaining himself through decades of agony in a demonstration of will that nothing in the history of the Sith had matched or would match again. That at the very end, given the right words from the right person in the right moment, he was capable of letting go. That even the Lord of Pain had a limit. That even the most complete architecture of hatred and dark side dependency and decades-long refusal had a fracture line in it. That even Darth Sion, at the bottom of everything he had built himself into, was still a person who could be reached. The horror of his story is what he was. The tragedy of his story is how long it took. And the thing that makes it matter, the thing that lifts it out of the category of simple darkness and into something that deserves to be remembered and thought about and felt, is the small and extraordinary mercy of an exiled Jedi who looked at the ruins of a man and saw, still, a man, and said the thing that needed to be said. Rest now. You are allowed.